Weeks after 3i Atlas vanished beyond the range of every major observatory, the data blackout officially ended. The comet, or whatever it was, had disappeared from all known orbital projections. For the public, it was over. Another interstellar visitor, gone before we could fully understand it. But inside a handful of research institutions, the story didn't end. It fractured. NASA's internal telemetry logs from the Deep Space Network showed an anomaly. A narrowband radio emission captured exactly 12 minutes after 3i Atlas left visual range. The frequency was 1420 MHz, the hydrogen line, a range often monitored for extraterrestrial communication. It wasn't strong enough to trigger automatic alerts, but it repeated twice in a 5-hour window, identical down to the microsecond. That shouldn't have been possible from a natural object moving at interstellar velocity. At first, researchers assumed equipment interference, but every attempt to replicate the error failed. The data wasn't a glitch, it was a pattern. Across 3 separate ground stations, Canberra, Madrid and Goldstone, the same packet arrived. 134 bytes of information, each byte forming a binary grid. When visualized, it created a perfect spiral, a logarithmic curve matching the trajectory of 3i Atlas before it deviated and vanished. Then, within the spiral, faint distortions appeared, irregular clusters of noise, symmetrical yet unexplainable. Someone in the internal thread joked it looked like a map. The joke didn't stay long. By week's end, all discussion threads regarding 3i Atlas were flagged for internal review and removed from shared access. Staff were told to await verification. A week later, verification never came. What replaced it was silence. The following month, several independent astronomers tried to trace the anomaly manually, reanalyzing open-source observation logs. But the hydrogen frequency band from that time frame had been overwritten on every archive server they checked. Even backup drives from 2024 showed data gaps precisely matching the timestamp of the event. Observatories in Chile and Hawaii confirmed similar checksum mismatches, as if the original data had been digitally erased, not edited, removed. And yet, something remained. On March 9th, a graduate researcher at the University of Toronto discovered a residual pattern, an energy decay signature still visible in the raw telemetry from Goldstone's analog recorder. The decay followed no known astrophysical model. It was as if the emission came from a gravitational echo, bouncing off something invisible, then returning inverted. The amplitude ratios matched nothing in existing catalogues. When plotted against the solar system's map, the echo's direction aligned exactly opposite to 3i Atlas's last known vector, a straight line into the Oort cloud. In simpler terms, the signal was coming back. By mid-March, an unmarked NASA memo circulated through limited channels under the tag non-terrestrial reflectivity. It theorized that 3i Atlas had interacted with something massive and uncharted at the edge of the solar system. The memo mentioned phase scattering, plasma coherence, and possible artificial reflection. Every term was followed by redacted segments. But one line remained visible. Source cannot be categorized under known cometry or stellar phenomena. Origin, undetermined. Signal persistence, ongoing. The wording was clinical, detached, but the implication was clear. Something near the outer boundary of our solar system had sent a signal back. Then came the second phase of silence. The Deep Space Network went into temporary maintenance. The official explanation was a software upgrade to telemetry protocols. But amateur radio astronomers noticed a curious detail. During those same 48 hours, every public channel transmitting hydrogen line data across NASA's API went dark. When service resumed, the metadata for March 7th to 12th had been replaced with empty packets. Yet one independent telescope in Finland, still running an older analog dish, caught something before the blackout. The same spiral pattern, weaker this time, but followed by a 3-second amplitude burst at 245 GeS. The final part of the waveform resembled a modulated carrier, intentional, not random. The observer, Jukanimi, uploaded the waveform to an open forum. Within hours, the post was deleted, and Nimi's account suspended for security review. His local observatory reported an unexpected data migration event that wiped all his stored telemetry. No one officially acknowledged the deletion, but traces of his data persisted in cached archives. The burst, when cleaned and frequency shifted, contained repeating numerical intervals, 1979, 2023, 2046, the years corresponding to Pioneer 11's last contact, the detection of 3I Atlas, and an unknown future date. Correlation or coincidence no one could prove. But what happened next made even the skeptics pause. On April 1st, NOAA's space weather satellite DSCOVAR recorded a sudden, localized increase in magnetospheric distortion, a microburst that didn't originate from solar activity. The direction of impact, approximately 30 degrees above the ecliptic plane, right where the 3I Atlas trajectory had vanished. It lasted 3 seconds. Then, silence again. Scientists began to question whether the object ever left the solar system at all. Some suggested it slowed down, or worse, stopped. The final internal report from the Deep Space Network contained just one paragraph of unredacted text. Residual transmission persists at threshold detection. Doppler shift indicates relative velocity approaching zero. No object travelling at interstellar velocity can simply stop, not without influence, not without reason. And yet all evidence pointed to one thing: 3I Atlas wasn't gone, it was waiting. By late April, the narrative around 3I Atlas had gone quiet. Officially, the interstellar object was no longer trackable, and any continuing research was described as unproductive. But a growing number of data scientists and astronomers across independent institutions noticed the same unsettling detail. Vast portions of raw telemetry, public logs, and archived imagery from February through March had vanished. Entire data repositories, from the European Space Agency's Open Archive to the Canadian NEOSSat imaging network, were missing specific timestamp ranges, always corresponding to the days immediately following the disappearance of 3I Atlas. Some attributed this to accidental corruption, but cross-analysis revealed something else. The missing blocks weren't random. They formed a pattern, identical time gaps down to the second, across multiple systems that weren't even connected. It was as if the same moment in time had been deliberately cut out of existence. An independent data forensics group, Astro Integrity, attempted to reconstruct fragments from local backups. What they found shouldn't have been possible. Low-level residual traces in the checksum headers, tiny data imprints that hinted at overwritten frames. The headers referenced coordinates that didn't correspond to any known celestial object. But when plotted against deep sky charts, the coordinates aligned with a void region just beyond the heliopause, a place with nothing detectable in any wavelength. The metadata timestamps were labelled with a single word: return. By May 2nd, strange inconsistencies began surfacing in global magnetometer readings. Several ground stations reported periodic fluctuations at 19-hour intervals, matching, almost perfectly, the frequency of the earlier 1420 ms hydrogen line bursts. The amplitude was faint but consistent, oscillating as if in resonance with something far away but synchronized to Earth's magnetosphere. These anomalies weren't caused by solar wind, geomagnetic storms, or auroral events. In fact, they occurred when solar activity was at its quietest. When the data was cross-compared with historical logs from the 1970s, analysts noticed the same faint periodic signature embedded in recordings from the Pioneer 11 deep space transmissions. It was as if the same invisible signal had been echoing across decades, unnoticed, faint, and repeating, until 3I Atlas appeared. At first, only a few researchers dared to publish their findings. Within days, most of their reports vanished from preprint servers. University press departments received urgent withdrawal notices. One of the reports, titled Temporal Recurrence in Deep Space EM Residue, briefly stayed online before being replaced by a blank PDF containing the NASA disclaimer watermark: data under review, pending reclassification. Meanwhile, the anomalies intensified. Satellite clock drift increased by nanoseconds every cycle of the 19-hour window. Radio telescopes from Australia to South Africa reported phase interference, almost imperceptible distortions in calibration tones, as though an external signal was subtly modulating the background noise. Engineers described it as ghosting, a form of harmonic mirroring that shouldn't occur naturally. And yet, deep within that noise, a pattern began to re-emerge. A small research team in Italy discovered that when they plotted the signal's modulation intervals as spatial coordinates rather than temporal ones, a coherent image formed, a spiraling path, identical to the binary pattern recorded during the final transmission from 3i Atlas weeks earlier. Only this time the spiral was reversed, inward, not outward. The trajectory led back toward the inner solar system. When this analysis reached the European Space Operations Centre, the response was immediate. The team's access credentials were revoked within hours. Their internal chat logs went silent. But before losing access, one researcher forwarded the results to an encrypted community archive. The accompanying message read simply, "It's coming back." In mid-May, the Deep Space Network conducted what it called a routine sweep of the outer solar system's boundary. The published summary reported no detectable anomalies, yet internal logs leaked weeks later suggested otherwise. DSN Node 14 in Canberra recorded a weak reflection, a moving object returning from beyond 200 AU at a deceleration inconsistent with gravitational forces. The reflection showed a rotational period of 19 hours. The data was flagged under Priority Level 7, reserved for unidentified deep space bodies. It was the same period the magnetosphere had been resonating with. The coincidence was impossible to ignore. At the same time, multiple satellites across low Earth orbit experienced transient software resets. Nothing catastrophic, just brief interruptions, all occurring within the same minute as the DSN's 19-hour timestamp. The synchronization was exact. The official explanation cited solar proton interference, but the solar observatories reported no flares, no storms, nothing. Something else had triggered the resets. By May 20th, NOAA's data integrity systems logged yet another unexplained phenomenon. Shortwave radio bands across the Pacific began to flicker in cycles of decreasing intensity. Amateur operators described the interference as a heartbeat, faint pulses at consistent intervals, gradually slowing with each day. When the pattern was isolated and plotted, it matched the deceleration curve of an object entering the gravitational influence of the solar system. In other words, something was approaching. But from where? Attempts to triangulate the incoming trajectory yielded conflicting results. One model pointed to a high-inclination orbit descending from above the ecliptic. Another suggested a shallow re-entry from the direction of the Oort cloud. Both implied an object roughly the same estimated mass and size as 3i Atlas, but the timing didn't make sense. If it had truly reversed course, its energy output should have been impossible for any known natural body. And yet, the data was there. Late in May, a classified update circulated among select agencies. Its title, Recurrent Object Detection, Cross-Domain Implications. The few lines not blacked out read, Anomalous Body, Designation Pending, exhibiting non-gravitational deceleration consistent with active vector control. Current analysis suggests self-regulation of momentum. Energy signature remains undetermined. To the public, nothing was said. The media moved on. Astronomers were told that further tracking of the region was redundant due to noise. Funding was quietly redirected. Every trace of the hydrogen line incident was scrubbed from searchable archives. But behind the scenes, preparations began. Infrared telescopes in Chile and Spain were placed on standby. A new software patch rolled out across multiple deep space networks, described as a filter upgrade to eliminate false positives from deep sky reflections. But analysts within the European Space Data Division noticed that the patch contained conditional triggers, automated suppression protocols that would flag and isolate any return signal matching a 19-hour frequency. The system was being programmed not to detect 3i Atlas again. As May turned to June, the intervals of the magnetospheric heartbeat slowed even further. Observers tracking the fluctuations noted one chilling synchronization. Every pulse now aligned precisely with the rotation period of the Earth. The cycles had merged. The implication was staggering. Whatever was generating the signal had locked onto our planet's electromagnetic field. By early June, the pulses stopped entirely. Instruments stabilized. The noise disappeared, but the relief didn't last. At 02:14 UTC, June 9th, the infrared telescope at Paranal Observatory captured a faint reflection, a diffuse, comet-like halo appearing briefly against the dark between Neptune and Uranus. The object's spectrum matched the original reading of 3i Atlas, except for one key difference. The emission wasn't reflective sunlight, it was self-luminous. The official report ended with a single line. Subject exhibits controlled re-entry behavior, origin uncertain, awaiting further analysis. Unofficially, a name had already begun circulating through encrypted channels. 3I Atlas, R, the return. By early July, the data networks that once tracked interstellar objects had fallen almost completely silent, not because there was nothing left to observe, but because the observational architecture itself was behaving unpredictably. Instruments from Australia to Hawaii began showing minute delays in their synchronization signals. Atomic clocks drifted out of alignment by nanoseconds, always during the same 4-minute window each day. The discrepancy was subtle enough to escape casual notice, yet perfectly timed to the predicted reappearance corridor of 3I Atlas. Independent observers monitoring the outer solar system started referring to this span as the return window, the theoretical period when the object, if it still existed, would re-enter the detection threshold. What no one expected was that the window would open from both sides at once. On July 3rd, a set of low-frequency anomalies was recorded simultaneously by radio arrays in Finland, Japan, and Arizona. The signals were faint but structured, rising in amplitude as the Earth rotated. Their pattern matched the residual 19-hour periodicity first linked to the object months earlier, except the cycle had now shortened by several minutes. A compression effect, perhaps, or a phase adjustment compensating for relative motion. Attempts to triangulate the source produced conflicting vectors. One pointed toward the region near Uranus, where the self-luminous halo had last been seen. The other toward the opposite side of the ecliptic, as if an echo were bouncing through some invisible mirror. The official line described it as interference from geomagnetic resonance, but no geomagnetic event had been logged that day. At 2 UTC July 5th, thermal sensors aboard the James Webb Space Telescope registered a temperature spike in an otherwise featureless section of space. For 46 seconds, the telescope's mid-infrared detectors displayed an emission signature inconsistent with any known stellar background. Too cold for a star, too hot for a dust field. Then, just as abruptly, it vanished. When the telemetry was re-examined hours later, the raw frames were missing from the archive queue. Instead, a checksum error replaced the file names, and the mirror server reported that the data had been archived to secure storage. Nobody could access it again. Throughout mid-July, subtle disruptions began affecting communication satellites, particularly those maintaining line-of-sight relays across the North Atlantic corridor. Engineers reported intermittent latency spikes and sudden packet loss that couldn't be attributed to weather or hardware. When mapped across time, the outages formed a moving band circling the planet every 19 hours, as though a wave of interference were orbiting in synchrony with the earlier magnetospheric pulse. Some speculated it was merely coincidence, a statistical fluke amplified by human pattern-seeking. Others were less certain. A small working group within ESA quietly reactivated an old deep space dish in Spain, originally decommissioned in 2019. Its analog components made it immune to the new digital filtering protocols that had been suppressing hydrogen line returns. During its first calibration run on July 12th, the dish detected a faint carrier tone barely above the noise floor. The signal persisted for 3 rotations of Earth and then dissolved into static. When converted to a spectrogram, the waveform revealed narrow harmonics at exact multiples of 14 to 20 MHz integer steps, forming what one analyst described as a ladder of intent. Each harmonic interval corresponded to known orbital distances of the inner planets. It was as if the emission encoded a map scaled in frequency instead of distance. Yet the pattern contained an anomaly, an extra rung positioned where no planet existed. If extrapolated outward, that rung aligned with the position 3I Atlas would occupy if it had slowed, reversed, and stabilized within the orbital plane. The team submitted a preliminary note to the International Astronomical Union. It was never acknowledged. Within 48 hours, remote access to the dish was revoked, and the hardware was physically disconnected for maintenance. On July 18th, a cluster of observatories in the southern hemisphere independently reported transient brightening in the sky near the constellation Eridanus. The flare lasted less than a minute, invisible to the naked eye but captured in ultraviolet. Spectral analysis indicated a narrow emission line centered again on 1420 μm, shifted by a Doppler factor suggesting the source was moving at less than 1% of light speed, far slower than any interstellar trajectory. Something had stopped. Attempts to cross-confirm through other wavelengths failed. The object emitted no visible light, no infrared heat beyond background levels, and no measurable ion tail. Still, the ultraviolet burst propagated outward as though reflecting from a surface that should not have been there. By July 20th, data from multiple sensors showed subtle gravitational irregularities across the outer planetary region. Orbital simulations of Neptune and Uranus required microscopic corrections millimeters at most, but enough to imply an external mass comparable to a small moon influencing their motion. Yet no such body had been detected. When the adjustments were applied retroactively, they perfectly predicted the current position of the spectral anomaly. The implication was unavoidable. 3i Atlas, or something derived from it, was back within the solar system, moving under its own control. Then the climate monitoring satellites began reporting unexpected albedo variations in the Earth's upper atmosphere, tiny shifts in reflectivity that repeated every 19 hours and 40 minutes. The cycle no longer corresponded to the magnetospheric heartbeat. It was slower, almost as if the emitter was synchronizing itself to the planet's rotation rate, fine-tuning a resonance. Seismometers in multiple regions began to register microscopic oscillations, ground movements too subtle to feel but detectable through ultra-sensitive instruments. The readings formed a waveform identical in frequency to the atmospheric pulses. Energy was coupling through the planet itself. Late on July 23rd, the European Space Operations Centre received an encrypted data packet from one of its relay satellites near the L1 point. The packet contained no message header, no source identifier, and no checksum. It consisted solely of raw binary digits, 1 to 9 bits forming an exact power of 2 matrix. When translated into grayscale, the data produced a simple image, a concentric spiral, identical to the first one recorded months earlier, except rotated 180 degrees. At its center lay a bright dot. Coordinates, when decoded, pointed not to deep space but to Earth's night side over the Pacific Ocean. At that moment the region was covered in dense cloud, impenetrable to optical observation. Infrared sensors detected nothing. Yet for exactly 19 seconds the magnetometers across the Pacific network spiked, then dropped to baseline. The next rotation of Earth brought the same spike again. By then the return window was closing. Analysts attempted to predict the next interval, but the model broke down. The periodicity drifted, stretching out of phase with terrestrial timekeeping, as if the source, now inside the system, no longer needed synchronization. In early August, the radio silence resumed. Telescopes saw nothing, instruments steadied, and communication networks normalized. Official statements announced the end of the anomaly and dismissed earlier disturbances as miscalibrations. But those still monitoring the background noise noticed one last change. The hydrogen line band, usually steady, now contained a permanent faint modulation, a barely measurable undulation cycling every 24 hours. It was synchronized not with the sun, not with the stars, but with the rotation of the Earth itself. The return window had closed, but whatever had crossed through it was no longer out there. It was here. By mid-August the signal ceased entirely, leaving behind a silence that was more oppressive than the noise itself. For days researchers watched their spectrographs and magnetometers, waiting for even the smallest flicker, but the baselines held steady. It was as if the universe had taken a breath and refused to exhale. Funding for the monitoring programs began to dwindle, quietly reallocated to climate adaptation and orbital debris mitigation, euphemisms that suggested a slow burying of the subject. But in the background, a few still watched the same handful of astronomers, physicists and analysts, who had followed 3i Atlas from its first detection to its inexplicable vanishing. They had grown accustomed to the faint irregularities that once hinted at its presence, and they knew what silence in space truly meant. Absence was never permanent. In early September, the first discrepancy appeared in a place no one expected. Lunar laser ranging experiments, those that bounce light off retroreflectors placed by Apollo missions, started showing subtle delays in their return times. Only a few microseconds, far within the margin of error, but the pattern was unmistakable. Every 24 hours and 38 minutes, the signal lagged slightly, then returned to normal. The timing did not correspond to lunar libration, Earth's rotation, or any known environmental effect. It was as though something was passing through the line between the Earth and Moon, refracting the light. The observation gap had begun. For decades, astronomers had referred to the small wedge of sky directly behind the Sun, an area, impossible to observe with conventional telescopes, as the solar blind. Now it seemed that something similar existed much closer, not as a region of glare, but as a moving void that erased data wherever it drifted. Satellites attempting to photograph the affected coordinates returned blank frames. The pixels weren't black, they were simply missing, replaced by uniform digital zeros, as though the camera had never captured anything at all. Yet the telemetry logs showed the exposure had occurred. During one such blackout, a solar observation satellite briefly recorded a reflected pulse of unknown origin, a perfect echo of its own transmission, but time-stamped exactly 1 hour before it had been sent. The engineers dismissed it as a system glitch, but the timing corresponded precisely to the position of the gap as calculated by independent astronomers. The implication was impossible. The signal had been received before it was transmitted. In late September, new anomalies emerged in low Earth orbit. Several nanosatellites reported spontaneous reboots, their onboard clocks resetting to December 2030, 8 years into the future. The effect lasted only seconds before automatic corrections restored proper time, but the coincidence spread across multiple systems, all within the orbital band directly below the predicted path of the observation gap. Atmospheric physicists studying ionospheric resonance noticed subtle ripples forming at regular intervals. The waves propagated faster than sound, slower than light, perfectly synchronized with the same 19-hour harmonic once tied to 3i Atlas. It was as if the planet's upper layers were responding to a signal that instruments could no longer detect directly. When compared against archived data, the modulation appeared identical to the early phase patterns seen before the object's disappearance. The cycle had returned, but the source was invisible. Some within the private sector began to notice too. Commercial Earth imaging firms reported corrupted imagery over the Pacific, where clouds seemed to shift in unnatural alignment spiral forms that repeated over consecutive orbits. Each frame looked almost identical to the last, as if a single template were being reused by the atmosphere itself. When one researcher enhanced the contrast, a faint geometric outline appeared beneath the cloud layer, hexagonal, symmetrical, and vast enough to span hundreds of kilometers. The file vanished from their servers 2 days later, along with the researcher's public account. The agency's official response called it an AI denoising artifact. By October, the observation gap expanded. GPS readings in several regions began to drift by a few meters each day, slowly rotating along a line stretching from the Pacific to the Indian Ocean. Airliners reported brief compass failures when crossing certain longitudes. Maritime communications degraded without explanation. The world, too distracted by surface concerns, barely noticed. Only those comparing raw sensor data across global networks saw the pattern. A moving ellipse orbiting Earth at an altitude of 38,000 kilometers, precisely within the geostationary belt. It was as if an invisible shell had formed there, rotating in perfect synchronization with the planet. At the center of that orbital path lay a point directly above the same Pacific coordinates from which the final hydrogen line signal had once originated. Late on October 14th, one final transmission arrived again through the same obsolete Spanish dish that had once mapped the harmonic ladder. The antenna, still unpowered, emitted a spontaneous burst across the 1420 MHz band, strong enough to trigger alarms in nearby facilities. The waveform was stable, humanly regular, lasting 19 seconds before collapsing into random noise. When decoded, it revealed a repeating binary structure identical to the first spiral ever linked to 3i Atlas, but with one difference. Its core no longer pointed outward. It was inverted, folding inward upon itself, the coordinates shifting from deep space to terrestrial reference frames. The center was no longer a distant object. It was the Earth's own position. Analysts who reviewed the data privately concluded that 3i Atlas had never left at all. It had transitioned, changing phase from visible matter to something undetectable by ordinary instruments, embedding itself within the fabric of the planet's electromagnetic field. The observation gap was not a shadow in space but a region of altered reality, a moving zone of suppressed interaction, expanding slowly each cycle. By November, it covered nearly a tenth of the geostationary ring. Satellites crossing its boundary vanished from telemetry for exactly 19 minutes, then reappeared with minor time discrepancies and inexplicable errors in onboard storage. One returned a fragmentary image before its memory degraded completely, a blurred curvature against absolute black, illuminated from within by faint lattice-like light, as though a structure composed of energy itself had been glimpsed for an instant before erasure. The official explanation cited sensor blooming. Privately, those who saw it agreed on one conclusion: the shape was not random. It resembled a mirror turned toward the Earth. The observation gap was still growing, and if its expansion remained constant, full planetary coverage would occur within 3 years. Whether it was a process, a signal, or something else entirely, no one could tell. All that remained certain was the rhythm, the pulse repeating beneath every instrument, a silent beat woven through the planet's own rotation, marking time not for us, but for whatever had arrived. By December, the observation gap was no longer a matter of orbiting geometry or sensor loss. It had become an environmental constant, an unseen companion tethered to the planet's rotation. It could not be photographed, measured, or mapped, but its effects rippled subtly through everything built on precision. Clocks that once synchronized through atomic resonance began drifting apart by fractions of seconds. Power grids fluctuated at exact intervals that engineers could not trace. Global navigation systems quietly recalibrated themselves every 19 hours, then every 18. The pattern persisted until it became background noise, a rhythm the planet seemed to learn. The first visible sign appeared above the South Pacific on December 9th. A pilot on a cargo route from Santiago to Auckland reported that the night sky had gone wrong, not darker, not brighter, just wrong. The constellations appeared displaced by a few degrees, as though the dome of the heavens had shifted imperceptibly. Astronomers confirmed that star positions, when measured during those hours, deviated slightly from predicted coordinates. It was as if the sky itself had forgotten where it was supposed to be. The deviation vanished at dawn. The following night, it happened again. No atmospheric distortion could explain it. The refraction layers were stable, and no solar storms were active. But when time-lapse imaging compared the frames, an anomaly emerged. The stars were moving, not the instruments. The celestial sphere was subtly reconfiguring itself. Observatories around the world tried to measure the drift, yet each location produced a different offset, as if the sky had fragmented into localized versions of itself. Some regions saw no change at all. Others recorded small rotations, arcs that only instruments could detect, but that spoke of something vast and mechanical beneath the illusion of stillness. The name came from a midnight broadcast on a low-power astronomy station in Chile, "When the Sky Forgets Us." It was supposed to be a poetic phrase, but within days it became the working term across research circles. The gap was no longer a gap, it was a process, one that seemed to involve memory itself. Light arriving from distant stars no longer carried the same spectral fingerprints. The hydrogen lines showed distortions, echoes of previous measurements, as if photons remembered past interactions differently now. Some scientists suggested that 3i Atlas had not simply vanished, but had modified the way information propagated through space, subtly rewriting the framework by which the cosmos rendered itself visible. If the observation changed reality, then reality had learned to protect itself by becoming unreadable. In mid-December, the European Space Agency resumed deep space monitoring despite political hesitation. A test transmission sent toward the coordinates of the former anomaly returned after 19 hours, an echo that should have dissipated forever. Its waveform was human-like, modulated with recursive symmetry, a pattern repeating inward like a digital spiral. When decoded, the signal formed a static image, a projection of Earth, viewed from above the Pacific, except that the continents were slightly displaced, as if observed from a version of reality just out of alignment with our own. The timestamp embedded in the packet did not match local time. It marked a moment exactly 3 days in the future. Analysts debated whether the signal was precognitive or merely delayed from another frame of reference. Either interpretation was equally impossible. In late December, weather satellites began detecting a new atmospheric layer at extreme altitude, a translucent sheath invisible to the eye, refracting ultraviolet light into faint spectral bands. At first it was dismissed as instrumentation noise, but later confirmed by LIDAR scans, a continuous semi-ionized region encircling the planet, pulsing faintly in synchrony with the observation gap's periodicity. The layer appeared to be moving closer to the surface, descending by meters each week. no chemical explanation fit. It was not ozone, plasma, or dust. It was something new, a veil between the world and whatever lay above it. Ground telescopes reported dimming starlight, as though the cosmos were retreating one magnitude at a time. Astronomers compared notes and found that each hemisphere now saw slightly different constellations, rearranged as though the universe itself were personalizing its reflection for each observer. Light had become subjective. Communications began to degrade in strange ways, not through noise, but through absence. Messages sent through fiber networks arrived intact, but metadata showed transmission times inconsistent with physics. Some packets carried timestamps from moments that hadn't yet occurred. Quantum clocks used in experimental labs registered simultaneity violations. Pairs of entangled particles no longer obeyed perfect correlation. The underlying constants were changing, minutely but steadily. When mapped against time, the changes followed the same curve that had once charted 3 atlases' inbound velocity. It was as though whatever had entered our solar system months ago was now completing its integration, not as an object, but as a new rule written into reality. On December 24th, the longest night of the year, every major observatory on Earth went offline for exactly 19 minutes. Power grids held, weather remained clear, and instruments reported no direct failure. Yet, when the systems came back, they all showed identical gaps in their logs, perfectly synchronized down to the millisecond. The missing time could not be accounted for. The Moon's position, when recalculated, had shifted slightly, as though its orbit had precessed forward by an unmeasurable but definite increment. No debris, no energy burst, no impact, just quiet realignment. The world continued as if nothing had happened, but those who monitored the hydrogen line band noted one final shift. The once faint modulation had stabilized into a new constant tone, smooth and unwavering, embedded permanently within the cosmic background. It was no longer a message or a pulse, it was part of the signal that defined space itself. Earth had been tuned. The observation gap stopped expanding the following week, as if the process had completed. Satellite data stabilized, and the star maps stopped drifting. For the first time in months, everything appeared normal. Yet when astronomers recalibrated their instruments, they found that the measured value of the speed of light differed by a fraction of a fraction, too small for public notice but undeniable in raw physics. The constant was not constant anymore. The universe still functioned, but on new parameters. Whatever had arrived under the name 3i Atlas had not come to visit, it had come to rewrite. The stars overhead now shone with familiar light, but their memory was gone. They no longer matched historical records, as though the sky had been reissued from some backup copy. Humanity stood beneath it, looking up at a reflection that still resembled the past but no longer remembered us.